everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hello, Rob. It's Diana.
And it's me, Jackie.
That was long. That was really long.
Thanks.
I didn't know we were singing. Can I redo mine?
No, it's over. We got to keep moving on. We got to move on. We have another guest. It's been a little while since we've had a guest in the studio, but we have a very special guest here. Special guest, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Colleen. I'm a BCBA, and I work in Shrewsbury Public Schools.
So we are very fortunate that we have Colleen here because today we're going to be talking about the VB-MAPP. Who wants to do it real quick? Because I'll skip it. It's verbal behavior, milestones, and placement.
No,
it's not placement.
You effed it up.
What is it?
Verbal behavior, milestones, assessment, and placement program.
I always forget the assessment. I remember placement. I remember program.
I always forget placement program. Like, what are those P's?
It's A. It's like and. Like I was like, why did they give that a big capital A? But okay, whatever.
So
whatever, Mark Sundberg.
Map.
That's true.
Yeah.
So this week we are going to be talking about the VB-MAPP. But you might want to know why we'd be talking about that in case it's the first time you've ever listened to the show. Well, that's because this is a podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research. And every week we pick a topic in the field. We get some recent articles related to that topic and we discuss it for an hour or so. And sometimes we get a special guest on like we have today because Colleen, you work as a BCBA in a public school system.
That's correct.
And
in Rob's public school system.
In my public. Yeah, I own it. It's mine. It's mine. I got promoted to president of the town. And Colleen has run many, many, many VB-MAPPs. And so when we were planning for this episode, we were talking about, questions we had and how to run it. And I know I've run them and Jackie and Diana, you've both run them. But I thought it might be nice to have the perspective of what is it like to run a VB-MAPP in a public school, which is not a setting I think most folks are as familiar with having a VB-MAPP being run and all the trials and travails of, getting all the materials together. And when the budget doesn't say you can spend the $1,000 for the kit, how do you find stuff to use this to run this assessment? So we're going to be going all over those topics today. So why don't we get started? And why don't, just in case you've never heard of it, because there certainly was a period in my career where I'd never heard of the VB-MAPP, why don't we talk about what the heck it is?
Before you do that, you want to tell the listeners the articles that we're reading too?
Not really, but I guess I should.
Yeah. They love it.
All right. So we'll be talking about a couple things. One will be the VB-MAPP itself. So if you have access to a guide or protocol of the VB-MAPP, it might be nice to look through that, especially if you have never seen one before. Otherwise, you will also need the two articles that we'll be talking about. The first is a comparison of outcomes from criterion-referenced and experimental evaluations of verbal behavior by Mason, Sawchak, Curtis, Andrews, Arriaga, and Pena, and that was published in Behavioral Development 2018. We'll also be talking about implementing the Verbal Behavior Milestones Assessment and Placement Program, parentheses, VB-MAPP, Teaching Assessment Techniques by Barnes, Mellor, and Rehfeldt, and that's in the analysis of verbal behavior from 2014. Okay, so now that you know all of the things that we'll be discussing, pause the show and read all those, and then come back and listen so that we can describe what the VB-MAPP is to you.
Yeah, they're all stimuli needed for the VB-MAPP.
Get yourself so many puzzles, flashcards, games, and toys.
Here.
Find a student who needs a VB-MAPP. Have them join in, listen into this podcast. They'll appreciate it. It's nice to know the nuances of the assessment you're about to receive.
That's funny.
So who would like to give an overview of the VB-MAPP itself?
Oh, I would.
You would?
I would.
Then do.
Sure. The VB-MAPP was developed by Dr. Mark Sundberg in 2008, and it was based on VBs.
Good old VB.
Oh, goodness.
Vernon Barrett's assessment of...
It was based on B.F. Skinner's Verbal Behavior, which was published in 1957. And if you haven't read that one, you probably should. It's a good one.
It's a rollicking good time.
It's a rollicking. I like that, rollicking.
I read the whole book to find out the twist at the end about the scorpion falling on the black table.
Oh, good.
I
went on maternity leave just to avoid that journal club.
the proto podcast when we have a journal club and we read verbal behavior. It was great.
Well, maybe that will be our next book club. We don't have one slotted. That should be fun.
It feels like a winter book club.
It does,
it's like
actually.
Cozy up with your 300-pound verbal behavior copy.
You'll hold it and your fingers will
the
instantly
winter of
warm.
our discontent.
I love a chapter that's 100 pages. That's chapter 3 on the man. There you go.
Sure. Well, if you don't know, B.F. Skinner's verbal behavior covers elementary verbal operants such as the mand, the tach, the echoic, and the interverbal. And the VB-MAPP really is an assessment that can look at social skills and language acquisition in children. It measures skills up to 48 months of typical child development, and it's important to note that it is criterion-referenced, not norm-referenced. And I know Diana loves this type of thing, so do you want to describe for our audience what the difference is?
Sure. So only some assessments are norm-referenced, which means that the assessment creators or others have gone to great and painstaking lengths to assess many people on their assessment and develop an overall, basically, bell curve as to who would fit into the assessment at different points in time. And you need a really large sample in order to do that. And when you have a norm reference assessment, then you can have your client receive that assessment and say, okay, they fit into the bell curve along this point in time, right? So either they're within the regular middle standard deviation, they're one standard deviation below the norm, or two or above, etc. So IQ tests are norm referenced. The Vineland is norm referenced.
I was just checking that. Yep.
But most behavior analytic assessments are not norm referenced, and this is really only because the time and resources that it takes in order to have a norm reference assessment. So the VB-MAPP is not currently norm referenced. Keep in mind, it's only 12 years old.
I know.
Which is like surprising given, I think, the scope with which or the breadth with which it's used in our field, which I think is a good thing, but it's a young assessment, really. So it's not shocking that it's not norm reference, but it is criterion reference. So in my article, they bring up that criterion reference point a few times, and the way that they talk about it is, quote, it's derived from task analyses and designed to measure changes in successive approximations of behavior. So in this case, so you're observationally and operationally defined a behavior, broken it down into its smaller components, and then tested to see sort of the building block components of that behavior, which of those are present, and they build upon one another.
Yeah. It's so crazy to think that the VB-MAPP has not even celebrated 16th birthday yet. It cannot even drive.
Right, yeah.
Nope.
Before this, Mark Sundberg had worked with James Partington on the ABLES assessment, which this sort of, I guess, kind of developed from. I'm not quite sure where the break in terms of why one versus the other came. I don't know if there's a story there.
But there is.
I did see Mark Sundberg at Babbitt, and that was the only thing I wanted to ask him. Like, I loved your talk. Hey, whatever happened with you and James Partington? But I wasn't sure if there was maybe like a bad break or something happened there. They just knew different directions, so didn't know if that was good.
But yeah, so the VB-MAPP has different parts to it. There's the milestones part, there's a barriers part, a transition part, a task analysis and supporting skills part, and then a placement part. So where you talk about placement and IEP goals. So the milestones assessment is 16 different domains, including a man domain, tact, intervocal, echoic, imitation, textual, transcription, listener responding, feature function class, play, social, on and on and on, right? And
visual perceptual, match to sample.
Yeah. And then they get into more of the, group skills. So a couple skills that you wouldn't think of as being directly related to verbal behavior, but they are, but in the sense of they seem more like school readiness type skills.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're divided into 3 different levels. So level 1 is where these milestones are typically achieved within 0 to 18 months for typically developing children. Milestones for level 2 are typically achieved through 18 to 30 months for typically developing children, and milestone 3 is typically achieved within 30 to 48 months for typically developing children. So, yeah. The barriers assessment measures 24 common barriers for learning, and that could include negative behaviors, absent weeks or impaired mans, absent week or impaired tasks. Well, that was a hard word for me to say. Tasks. Absent weak or impaired echoics. So it's just looking at all the barriers that may impede learning.
Yeah, and the barriers is more, not always, but is more of an indirect reference to, you did all the milestones, and then from that, well, based on where you were in the milestones, this is where you come out on the barriers.
Right, yeah. And then the transition section is where they have 18 assessment areas to help answer the question of whether a student is ready for a less restrictive environment. So what that looks like. And then the final assessment is that placement and IEP goal. So you're taking what you learned from the assessment and then developing goals and objectives based on that. Yeah.
So the strength of the VB-MAPP, I guess, certainly is in the fact that it is an assessment that is directly related to verbal operants, rather than, sort of just topographical skills.
You love that? I
do. Yeah, we all should really love that. And I think, so certainly for those of us coming from the background of single subject design, I think it's nice to have something that is not norm referenced to some extent. I mean, there's a place for norm reference testing, but a criterion reference testing allows you to see what can you, the individual, do, and what do you, the individual, still need to learn to make progress across these other settings. Back in the day, we used to use the transitions assessment. I thought we found that to be pretty helpful once we run the milestones.
Yeah. I tend to do them all together now, but yes, because it's not standardized, you can kind of use the pieces that are helpful. So we did use that when we were trying to figure out if kids should go less restrictive, especially in preschool. So
I find it to be a really comprehensive assessment, and particularly if that's the question that you're trying to answer, right, is how ready is this learner to participate in the general education classroom, and are they going to get what they need to from that setting? It touches on a lot of really important areas, and a lot of them do tie back into verbal behavior and listener behavior, but there are other areas as well that it's looking at, like play and social skills. And then when you bring in the barriers component, that's a really important piece too, because we're not just looking at behavioral deficits, but also behavioral excesses.
Yeah. And one thing I love about it too is that you can see progress from one test to the next test, right? From one assessment period to the other so very clearly, right? So as a parent looking at the VB-MAPP assessment, I don't necessarily have to understand, right, exactly what's going on, but I can see that level 1, 2, and 3 are increasing in complexity. And then I can see based on the assessment how well my student is, my child is doing across those different ones, across testing sites or testing times.
And especially, I think nowadays when we have so many states that are really looking at the achievement gap between children who start receiving special education services and who are not receiving special education services, when you're looking at norm reference tests, there is going to be a ceiling, depending on the student's disability. So if the only thing you do, well, here's your student's, Stanford Binet IQ, that is probably not going to change a lot regardless of how much intervention you put in place. Whereas something like the VB-MAPP, you can definitely show that there is a decrease in the gap of learning because you're going from skill to skill, and it's easy to teach skills. You can't change someone's overall cognitive profile. That's just not what those tests are designed for.
IQ is often not indicative of actual functional performance in the classroom. So one could have score very, very highly on an IQ test, but exhibit low independence in other areas. And the VB-MAPP is pretty well tailored, I think, to capturing the types of independence that are necessary to function well in the classroom. So I think it might be more helpful than an IQ test anyway. Yeah, and one thing I love about the VB-MAPP as well is that it's directly tested, right? So you are getting the results not from what someone says is happening, but what you've actually seen and observed, which sometimes can be cumbersome because one of them is like, can emit 100 tags, right? And then you're like, all right, 1, 2, 3, 4, trying to count all of those tags.
Once you start getting to level 3 in the V, I mean, I think one of the big problems, and I think you'll see it a little bit in the studies we discuss, is when you're level 1 is very easy no matter the type of learner, the age of the learner. It's very easy to run level 1. Level 2 starts getting more complicated. Level 3, you're sort of, I think we always found that if you had a student, it was the first time you met them and they were performing at level 3, you'd sort of stop and be like, yeah, I think they're fine. We'll follow this later.
Usually when students start performing at level 3, that's when I start looking at what sort of norm reference tests could we give them and try to look for, those beginner norm reference tests like the Wyatt, that's a little bit high, but even the Bracken I've been finding is a good one to go to after kids kind of top out of the VB-MAPP. So to that end, I don't think I've ever truly counted the 1,200 or more.
It starts
because at that point,
I
have tried. You keep track of what they do, but at that point, you can kind of start looking at what else you can assess them with as well.
I really start second guessing myself at that point. I'm like, do I even know 1,200?
Right.
Oh, listen to respond by feature function class. Like, what? Okay. Well, find the brown one, find the red one. I'm out. I don't have any more.
Yeah.
It's more the problem of being able to think of 1,200 to assess.
Right.
Yeah.
By the time you get to 500, you're like, I think I did this one already. Twice.
If you've never run a VB-MAPP before, it can be time consuming, right? So I've run a VB-MAPP anywhere between 4 hours, with a child that knew a lot versus 10 hours, if you're trying to assess every little thing. So what's that, your experience?
Yeah, I've never really timed it because, you know, in the public school setting, we kind of run it over the period of days that we have in the window to assess. So we break it up. So cumulatively, I don't know how long it's taken me, but certainly if a kid is functioning at a level 1, you know, on the VB-MAPP, you can run that fairly quickly.
Yes.
If they are functioning in level 2 and level 3, it's going to take you a little longer because you have to hit on all the different observation points, and just scheduling that sometimes can take a little while. So.
Yeah. One of the other nice things, you know, we've kind of come about it a bit, but when you're running a VB-MAPP, you have, you know, the guidebook. And if you have a basic understanding of the verbal operants and a basic understanding of human behavior, it's not too complicated to sort of understand what is being asked for each of these tasks, because some of them are very direct. You know, so for example, tact is very much like what you'd think. I'm holding up lots of, you know, flashcards, you know, interspersing them with other tasks. Interverbals, you're asking sort of questions and fill-ins, listener responding, find the this, find the that. But then there are also a lot of areas where you have to do observation, you know, so it's good that you can determine that a student is unable to mand or is able to mand with certain amount of, you know, descriptors or with actions or man for actions in a controlled environment. What's really nice is to see in their actual current learning environment, how often are they using that skill? Because certainly I think we've seen students who would mand when you sort of have all their favorite candies in front of them and you're like, woohoo, I've hid them away. They'll mand for the items. But then when you go into their typical preschool classroom or kindergarten classroom, they're quiet. They don't make a sound for the full hour that you're observing them. And even when there are opportunities, you know, you go in when there should be opportunities to mand. And it really does, I think, make you realize that students, when they're developing, as we'd expect, their language, how much kids really talk like all the time.
True.
They're always asking for things and following complex instructions and following other kids around and imitating their behavior. And I think it becomes
asking questions.
Yeah. It becomes very clear how when you have a child who is performing at level 1 or emerging level 1, just how different their overall verbal behavior is from, you know, typically developing, you know, 18-month-old or 2 months old or however old the student you're assessing.
It really helps you see how really impaired a student can be too if their verbal operants are out of balance, because you have students who maybe their tact and echoic scores are up in level 3, but their manding score is in level 1. So, you know, those are the kids who will get up and be really self-sufficient but never interact with anyone the whole day, which is also a problem, right? So it allows you to see those splinter skills and really where their deficits are according to how they're using the language that they have.
I think some of the later task analysis sections as well, if you're not as familiar, can really help you just drill down and figure out like what's going on with this skill? Why is it not being learned? I mean, I don't even think I thought about social skills as potentially being a deficit skill due to a weak command repertoire until I started running the VB-MAPP. Like, well, I guess that makes sense, because what are you doing in social interaction? You're making comments, you're asking questions, you're asking for attention. If you don't ever mand for anything in your environment, you probably aren't having that many meaningful interactions with people. Or maybe you're imitating them, but then that's all it is. And the older you get, the less that is going to maintain any sort of a, you know, what we'd consider a friendship.
Do you consider all your social interactions just getting something out of them?
Well, that's the beginning of a lot of. Well, yeah, I'm getting new information.
Just kidding.
No, Dinah, we all know that I see my social interactions. It's just SD to start talking louder so that I can hear myself talk better.
I know.
That's what I do. I have no manned repertoire. I made it this far.
Why has he just been talking to that mirror this whole time?
That's my best friend.
I didn't generalize my skill outside of mirror. Oh, no.
Before we move on, I was just going to say, I know that we kind of alluded to how the VB-MAPP is scored, but maybe we should go over that in a little bit more detail, because I really love the scoring system for it.
All right, so you always run the milestones first, because the other two portions, the barriers and the transition assessment, kind of rely on how the student scores on the milestones assessment. There is the task analysis portion in the back, which people who look at it the first time, they're like, I have to answer all of these questions. And it's like, no, you have to go through the front of the manual and do level 1, level 2, level 3. I personally like to start by doing the observations first. I made some forms when we used to do preschool assessment and have arena evaluations that allowed us to do the portions of observing students when we would do their site visit. And we would have a better idea of where they were going to be when they came in if, we were going to run the VB-MAPP as part of the arena. So you would have the materials available that you would need if you knew that this student was likely to at least score into level 2. So and that gives you a way to kind of get a good chunk of the assessment out of the way by doing the timed observations. Because you can observe for more than one skill during a 30-minute time if you know what skills you're observing for. So to that end, that's what I would do first. And I would try to look at each kind of column separately. So, if, for example, we'll use manned and they score through level 1, then I would try to run manding level 2. But at some point, if you can tell if the student's kind of going to top out, and I don't force them to keep going through all of level 3 if we've only gotten through the first 2 targets in level 2. So then you might move on to the next verbal operant milestone. So after you've run all of those, you can go ahead and score the barriers assessment. And I believe that's the order it goes in, barriers and then transitions. So those kind of build on each other. So you do them in that order. The barriers and transition assessments are super easy and fast to score after you've done the labor intensive part of the milestones. And both of them give you this nice little block kind of color coded graph that you can start for the student. And there's lots of resources online that are free. Like you can start an Excel graph and put these things in and save it for that student so that the next time you run it, you can add on in a new color.
Yes.
And see how much color they've added.
Right.
Which means progress since the last time you've run the VB-MAPP.
Yep.
We use the VB-MAPP app.
Yep.
So it's called VB-MAPPapp.com.
MAPP.
And
I work in a public school. We can't always afford these fancy apps. So I do it using Excel.
Yep, but you can do it with the VB-MAPP app. And
you can even use a pencil.
That's true. You could also use a pencil.
A colored pencil.
Yes.
But this is really nice because you can put it in the app automatically and then it charts it for you. And this was created by a woman whose daughter had a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, and she saw how cumbersome the scoring was. And so she made the app. She actually went back to school to get her master's in special ed and ABA, so she understood what was going on, and then created this app.
Cool.
Yeah.
Now the overall, so when you're scoring the VB-MAPP, you're scoring usually some number, how many pluses, how many minuses, how many mans, how many, bids for attention. And then the final score though, it sort of lumps it into, a score. The milestones are all 0, 1, 0, 1, 2, right? Are there 3?
It's 0, half, and 1.
Okay, 0, half, and 1.
So you get 0 if you don't complete any. Like, for example, at level 1, it might be something, and don't quote this, it might be something along the lines of, emits 5 mans in, a day. Mm-hmm. And if let's do 6, because that's easier to put in half. Let's say it's 6. If they don't do any, they're getting 0. If you record 3, they're getting a half. And if they do 6, they're scoring 1 point for that.
Yeah.
And then the barriers and the transitions are 0 to 5 or 4.
Yeah, it's more of sort of like a rating scale sort of idea. That can be a little confusing, especially when you explain it to parents or the first time you're scoring it, because you actually want like a lower score on the barriers.
Yeah.
Because that means, the way I try to explain it, means you have less barriers to learning or accessing a less restrictive environment. So you want to see that score go down over time. And then transition, a higher score is better because that means you have more skills in your repertoire, which would lend themselves to accessing less restrictive learning environments. So you would like to see that go up over time.
I kind of wonder if maybe they want to do transitions first, then barriers, because I feel like when you're going through the results, you're like, so here's the milestones, and it's like, oh no, they filled out a lot, that's good, or oh, they didn't fill out that much, that's not good. Then you get to the barriers, and if you see that it's like, wow, they scored great on this, like, ooh, actually, that's really bad. Oh, okay.
Come on.
And then you get to the transition, and they're like, okay, but this one's low, and you're like, actually, no, we want this one to be high.
Well, there's a way to explain it nicely, Rob.
Oh, so that wasn't it?
No.
Right there?
No, because it's not, no assessment's meant to be a judgment.
Right.
Right? So
except it does,
good or
my
bad.
one picky thing about it is it does use the word like defective man.
Oh, yeah.
I'm like,
I don't care for that.
I don't understand either of those words, says the average parent. Like, what do you mean defective? What does that mean?
I know.
What's a man?
I don't like
Seriously
that.
not helpful.
I don't like that word, but, I just try to say that this skill is not yet mastered. So that's what they need to work on. We're going to write a goal for that.
Yeah. I really try to focus on calling it areas for growth versus weaknesses as well. So that's all that is highlighting is areas for growth. And it does set it up in such a way where it can assist you in identifying what's probably the first thing that you want to target within one of these domains. So, and the way that the milestones assessment is set up is really cool, I think. So it's like a tower, and it's level 1's on the bottom, and then level 2's above that, and level 3's on the top. And each domain is like a vertical tower.
Yes.
And then there's, maybe 8 or so areas within each domain, within each level. So you can score that half or full point for each of those little levels within the domain. And then they'll get colored in. So you'll see in the manned category, all of level 1 colored in, and then sparsely colored in level 2, let's say, for example. And then when you come back and do it the next year, you can start where you left off and fill in with a new color. So then it's a really nice visual, I think, for parents to see how their child has learned new skills over time.
I have one. You in podcast land. You can't see it, but it's really pretty.
It's beautiful.
There it is.
It's really
all
beautiful,
the columns.
and it's got a lot of colors filled in, which is always nice to see. I think it's easy. That part of it is easy to show to parents and help have them understand the different areas.
And then if you're running it every year, like you were saying, Colleen, you just use different colors, or if you're using the app, you have different colors. So it's very easy, again, to demonstrate where progress has been. And since these are going to be, you're using these results to really directly generate what IEP objectives are the most relevant for the student, it's very likely that you're going to create an IEP that is very closely tailored to the needs of the student, as opposed to just sort of guessing, well, they don't talk a lot, so I guess they should work on repeating, or maybe they should work on asking questions, but that may not be appropriate based on the fact that they don't actually have a lot of their verbal operants. They don't have any verbal operants at this point.
Over time, running the VB-MAPP becomes more reinforcing for you as a practitioner because it's so much easier the second time. It so much informs your practice. There's a task analysis that breaks down okay, I've run this twice and they're just not getting manned number 8. Why? And you can go to the task analysis and see all the sub-skills kind of broken down of these are all the things that they would need to do to master this overall skill. And you can very much target and break down what they're not doing. So I think it becomes very useful. It becomes easier over time. And, it's the color-coded chart is very reinforcing for you to see all the things that they've learned because of you over the past 6 months or year.
So the VB-MAPP can be run more frequently than most of our norm reference tests as well, because the norm reference test you really can't run more than once a year, maybe even sometimes 2 or 3 years, because it becomes its own confound. There's a lot of reactivity there. But with the VB-MAPP, you technically could run it as often as you want to. But how often do folks usually find it being run in their settings?
6 to 12 months, probably. That's what I would say.
I mean, I've started using it kind of as a curriculum outline. I've let it sort of inform how I write IEP objectives to include sort of a next sequence of targets so that you can keep moving through them in order. And, it's not like you can't look at the chart in between administrations and say, oh, they mastered this one. What's next? So you can kind of keep them moving through these things throughout the year because it's not a norm referenced assessment.
Excellent. Well, why don't we take a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll talk about the research, and then we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about troubleshooting the VB-MAPP in a variety of settings. All right, don't go away. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu. See you there!
And we are back talking about the VB-MAPP with our guest, Colleen Callahan, and the rest of your ABA Inside Track friends.
We're still here, too.
We're still here.
I'm still here.
I know. In the break, we were all excited to talk more, so we had a pretty short break. But before we get back to the discussion, I just want to remind all the listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. By listening to the show, you can earn 1 learning credit. All you need to do is listen to the full episode, then go to the website, abainsidetrack.com/get-CEUs, and you can apply for a learning credit. All you'll need to do is, that and know the 2 secret code words that we've hidden in the episode. I'm going to tell you the first one now. It is kitchen. KITCHEN.
You're like, oh no, how do I spell kitchen?
How do I spell the word kitchen? What's behind me? It's a kitchen. If I pointed to it, what would you all say?
Kitchen.
Hey, that's a tack. I did that with some supervisees the other day where I was trying to show them the difference between, an impure tact and an interverbal. And I held up an object and they're like, what? You want to do something with it? It took them quite a while before they just tacted the object. But it wasn't kitchen. Kitchen. All right. So before we get back into assessment running, let's take a little break and talk about some of the research about the VB-MAPP. And now we're not going to talk about research related to verbal behavior because there's a lot of that research and it's not all directly related to this assessment. So we've tried to find articles that had to do with the actual, either the running or the training of the VB-MAPP. So why don't I go first and I'll talk about the Barnes and colleagues about implementing the VB-MAPP and how to teach people to run the VB-MAPP. Now, again, we've been talking about all the positives of the VB-MAPP. One of the challenges, though, and one of the reasons you might not see this assessment run very often, say, in a public school setting, is because you actually have to have a basic understanding of verbal behavior and some understanding of behavior analysis to use this assessment. Otherwise, it doesn't make a lot of sense, and the terminology is not one that the average person would know. So you have to have some sense of what verbal behavior is. And there's always the question when you're teaching someone how to run something new, what do you need to learn that new assessment? Is it just reading the manual? Is it just reading the manual plus some amount of training, like you go to a workshop? Is it you need to have actual full behavior skills training? And especially with an assessment like the VB-MAPP, like we've been talking about, it's great because you can use this. You have this great criterion-reference assessment. You're able to write these great IEP objectives. But if you didn't actually run it correctly, all of your objectives are now possibly garbage because they're not based on an accurate representation of what the student is able to do in terms of expressing verbal operants. So the purpose of this article is to say, what would one need to do to train an individual who isn't a behavior analyst to perform level 1 and 2 of the VB-MAPP? So the participants in this study, it was a little bit of a cheat because they were 2 school psychologists who had tons and tons of experience working with lots of different types of assessments. So they weren't any stranger to some of the basics of assessment running, build rapport with the student you're working with, take lots of breaks, show an interest in the child themselves, do some pre-assessment work so that you know exactly what you should and don't need to be testing. They also had, certainly a handbook of the VB-MAPP. And then guess what? They were also in grad school to take the classes needed to sit for their BCBA. So these weren't just like random people they picked off the street to teach how to use the VB-MAPP. So take the results when we get to them with a grain of salt there. Now, the researchers had a nice PowerPoint of, what's the VB-MAPP and describing the VB-MAPP.
That's all you need. PowerPoint.
Which is, that's all you need. They also had a really fancy checklist. And actually reading this checklist, did I do that? When last time I ran the VB-MAPP, did I remember to do that?
I felt like all my VB-MAPPs have been inadequate after reading this.
Well, this will, and the limitation is they didn't actually check whether they needed these things in the checklist. It was a team of clinicians who would observe lots of VB-MAPPs run. So they were trying to pick what are the components that need to be run, get better outcomes in terms of a VB-MAPP. Again, a lot of them had to do with, are you running all the probes? Are you interspersing? One of the things we talked about was the different types of operants that get assessed. But this checklist purports you probably shouldn't. And it's probably good practice to not just sort of drill and kill. Like, let's do those 1,000 listener response by feature function class. You want to be interspersing the different operands. You want to have lots of times for breaks. You want to be setting up opportunities to have the individual manned or tacked in a naturalistic environment. So these are kind of the common pieces of the checklist that we hadn't really talked about so far. So this checklist, similar to the VB-MAPP, has a low score. You either get a 0, a 1, or a 2. So for example, it'd be something like intersperse interverbals throughout the assessment. So you'd get a score of a 0 if you didn't probe at all, or if you probe just like drill and kill, like what does a cow say? What does a dog say? Like you just sort of drilled the kid with a bunch of interverbals. You get a score of 1 if you kind of went in between what they thought was the best number of interspersals, and you get a 2 if you never probed more than 15 interverbal responses in a row. So some of these felt a little arbitrary in that the clinicians had just said, I think these are important. And they were pretty honest that this checklist isn't based on some sort of like highly socially valid assessment that they did over and over and over. It was just a lot of people who've done the VB-MAPP putting out their 2 cents as to what they thought was important. They used a multiple probe design across their participants. They had Lucy and Ethel. Did you get it?
So
get
silly.
it.
I love when they do that with participants.
I actually didn't get it until you wrote how adorable. I just was like, I like those names.
For those of you who are not 100 years old, Lucy and Ethel were a comedy duo from the TV show I Love Lucy, which came out in 1901. I don't know, when was that? The 50s?
1901.
It was in the 50s. Remember the 50s? Of course you don't, because we're not that old. And really the score was just after the training that they provided Lucy and Ethel, what was the percentage of points that they earned on their checklist? And then how long did it take them to reach a mastery criterion of 90% on all the possible points they could get? So they started with a, pretest probe. So they told Lucy and Ethel, here, read this protocol and guidebook that everyone has when they buy a copy of the VB-MAPP at levels 1 and 2. Here are the materials that you could be using in the assessment. And then 7 to 10 days later, they said, here's a kid, do the VB-MAPP, or you've got a kid, do the VB-MAPP level 1 and 2. And the instructions just complete the assessment and let us know when you're done. And they got no feedback or error correction, which, it's a little weird, but I suppose the average individual who just decided, you know what, I'm going to try out this verbal, behavior milestones, and
doesn't look too hard.
Probably what it looks like when they run that assessment. Then we got to BST. And if you are saying to yourself, I'm pretty sure the results of using BST will be everyone did better after BST. Surprise! You're prescient. That's pretty much what happened. Let me describe what the BST was, though. So they started with kind of a little workshop. They had a couple other clinicians also receiving training on the VB-MAPP. They had that PowerPoint, which Diana probably is already. Have you already written the authors for a copy of their PowerPoint, Diana?
I did.
Or you wanted to make your own, I want someone else's PowerPoint. They gave descriptions and examples of each operant and how you would assess it, which honestly, my dream VB-MAPP workshop would be like, I'm going to go through every single subtest and I'm going to show you what it looks like. Because I always have the sneaking suspicion, especially when I get to level 3, like, I'm not running this right. I'm making a guess. This probably isn't how it should look. There's a better way to do this. So I would love to see this. And they also talked about general assessment techniques, like make sure you intersperse your probes, have a rich environment for the child, make sure the child has access to preferred items, they can take breaks, all the things that you would expect to see in pretty much any assessment. But some of the specifics for the VB-MAPP would be that you should be running both tabletop and naturalistic probes when you're doing the assessment, kind of like we talked about. This whole thing took about an hour and a half, 2 hours to do all these workshops. They then had a modeling component where they would watch, the experimenters and the participants would watch videos of experienced clinicians running the different behaviors on the VB-MAPP checklist. So not exactly running each of the subtests, but sort of this is what a session could look like. They also had a text on the video so you could see what they were doing. They showed an organized assessment kit, which, Jackie, you were looking up in the break how much an assessment kit would cost if one were to purchase it.
Yep, according to different roads. You can buy it on different roads. difflearn.com. The VB-MAPP assessment kit with manual is $829.95.
Okay, so we'll be back later on with some money-saving tips for your VB-MAPP kit. So they showed the kit, they showed them a pre-assessment interview form, they showed them RACID, so the reinforcer assessment form. And then they did everyone's favorite, rehearsal and feedback, where they'd have 3 or 5 target behaviors. They'd say, okay, we're going to role play. Here's a situation. You're running these subtests. Here's some items you can or cannot use, depending on if you want to use them or not. And then they'd expect to see 3 to 5 target behaviors from their long checklist. And we talked about a few of those. So they'd say, do probes for man's, tax, and listener responsions. And I also want you to see if books capture the child's attention. That was kind of their scenario. And then they'd go. And they'd get performance-specific feedback. Here are the things you did. Here are the things you would have earned 2 points. Here are the things that are only 1 point. Here are the things that were 0 points. Here's how you would fix it. Just like you'd expect from any rehearsal and feedback. Then after that, they did post-test probes, and they were just looking for the participants to get 90% across 2 probes for levels 1 and 2. So running 2 VB-MAPPs where they were observed by someone, which I'm trying to logistically imagine what this study looked like, because it felt like these experimenters were like following them around while they did their actual jobs doing all these assessments, which I guess is what it would have been. But
maybe there was reason for them to do that, right?
Well, I mean, yeah, it might have been a setting where they wanted that or they wanted the extra training. I'm not sure. And then if they were at a remedial teaching, if the participants didn't get over 90% of their possible points, and it was just more specific feedback to the individual's performance. So again, no surprise, Ethel and Lucy, before all this training, did not go above 90%, though they did okay on some of the skills. I think that has to do with the fact that these were experienced psychologists who had done lots of assessments in the past, so they knew how to run general assessments. They just couldn't do anything related to the VB-MAPP itself. And then after the group instruction, they did actually see a little bit of improvement, but it was really when you got that additional feedback that both of them were able to go above 90% on their post-tests. I think Lucy needed 1 remedial training session. Ethel got it right off the bat. So really just having this workshop and this extra practice, which took, like 3 hours, I think total, they said, both of them were able to run a really good VB-MAPP. Now, again, some thoughts here. It would have been nice to see a little bit better on what was their performance throughout the whole process, because realistically, most people are going to get trained in the VB-MAPP by going to a workshop about the VB-MAPP, and then they'll run the VB-MAPP. If they're lucky, someone in their setting has experience and they can watch them doing a VB-MAPP, maybe do some of this BST, but it might not be the case.
Sometimes you're just given the manual.
Yeah.
You're like, go for it.
This looks like a good assessment. You try it. Tell us how it goes.
Yeah.
The authors also talked about how they didn't do level 3. Would this have generalized to level 3? You'd like to think so, but like we've talked about,
it's hard.
It's a hard level. It's very different in some ways than certainly level 1, but even level 2. They really did not pick participants. I mean, if you wanted to pick participants who were going to have the best chance of super success, they really did a good job in picking the participants. What would you get if you had, say, like a graduate student who was working at a private school or public school as like an intern or something? If you gave them this amount of training, would they have performed as well as fast? You would think probably not, but maybe they would have.
We don't know.
We just don't know. Also, is there a way to speed this up? Because again, it took 3 hours. I had said it took 3 hours to do the initial BST, but when they did the remedial teaching, which, Lucy needed 3 sessions. I think I said she only needed 1. Ethel needed only 1. That took a long time. They didn't say how long it took. They just said the remedial teaching took the longest time. So 3 hours seems like a reasonable amount of time to do training to get to high percentage of success. But, 10 hours, that might be more than you can spare. 4 hours, that's not that much different than 3. So that's information that I would have loved to see. And then like we were kind of talking about looking through the checklist, there were a few things on there that I said, I wish I'd done that. That's a good thing to remember. But there were 1 or 2 that I said, would I really have needed to do that to have run a good VB-MAPP? I don't know. So I'd like to see a little more there with maybe some social validity with that, or some outcomes of using this checklist versus not using this checklist. That would be nice.
I agree, because I think that their criteria that they've established here are just basically their own opinions about what makes a good VB-MAPP session, right? And I tend to agree with them because I think that you are going to be able to establish a much better rapport and probably move through the necessary steps of the assessment more quickly if it's run in this combination of table and incidental naturalistic style. But we don't actually know, right? So there was no comparison between what they might consider a 0 score with just rattling off rapid fire questions versus a 2 score where they've interspersed them and made them more fun, right? Now, I would prefer the second style, but we don't know if those may affect the learner's performance on the test, right? So they've based all of this off perhaps an assumption that this is the better way to run the VB-MAPP, when in fact we may not actually know. That would be my potential criticism.
Yeah.
Something to think about. We just don't know, right?
No.
And yes, they're starting with the experimenters here, Lucy and Ethel, who are most likely to be able to run an assessment in this style. And they still needed a lot of training as well. There's a lot of questions I think that remain as far as how exactly should this look? And we don't really know.
Mm-hmm.
No one knows.
No one. There's no way to find out either. So, oh well. I would love to see a little bit more detail in terms of the follow-up, because it would be great to have this option spread to more locations, because certainly I think we all know a lot of behavior analysts who are like, oh, of course I use the VB-MAPP. I love using the VB-MAPP. A lot of, say, private schools or centers or places that focus on using, verbal behavior procedures only that would use the VB-MAPP. But I don't know of a lot of individuals who aren't BCBAs using it in other settings. And there are a lot more of those other settings than there are of settings where behavior analysts are in charge of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that really is you're missing out. I mean, I think, we have those conversations. The difference between verbal behavior and what a lot of people think of as language is we think about language functionally, and they think about it topographically. And we all know who's right, and it's us, of course. Oh, I'm getting the look. I was clearly being
I've collaborated with lots of SLPs using the VB-MAPP.
You got 2 looks right
there.
Just
saying.
I know.
You got an entire table of
Oh,
looks.
my good God. I'm sorry. I'll raise my eyebrows a lot more next time I say that.
People at home can't see your raised eyebrows.
Well, even when you could see them, you apparently did not think. You thought I was being serious. No.
I was just like, oh, God, now I got to go back and explain this.
Yeah. Samesies.
No, I'm joking.
When I just want to move on and talk about Mason, Sawchak, Curtis, Andrews, Arriaga, and Pena.
Then you do that. You go ahead and you do that.
I'm going to do that.
You live your dream.
The end result of my study is going to dovetail a little bit, I think, with your study.
Mm-hmm.
But
I love it when that happens.
I will let our listeners start to figure out what that is as I go through this. So with the Mason et al. Study, they wanted to compare the VB-MAPP to another verbal operant assessment in order to determine, is the VB-MAPP testing what we think it's testing, right? So it's a question of validity here. These are not norm-referenced assessments, as we mentioned already. They're criterion-referenced, and I have nothing against VB-MAPP. I think it's a very, very strong assessment. But we are sort of out there on a limb a little bit and saying well, yeah, we're testing for these things, and then we're finding these things with the test that we made up, right? So it would be helpful if there were another assessment that might help to verify some of the findings from the VB-MAPP. So they wanted to compare the VB-MAPP to another assessment that doesn't have a super fancy name. It was just called Verbal Operant Analysis, which was based on Lerman and colleagues' 2005 article. And what they were attempting to do here is say, if we have one learner take the VB-MAPP and then take the VOA, do we have similar findings across the two? And if we do, what that can help us determine is if we have what's called convergent validity between the two assessments. So with validity, you're checking to see, is the thing that I'm testing with this test actually the thing that I'm measuring over time, right? And if both of these are in agreement that, yes, let's say this individual has a high Manning repertoire. If I can demonstrate that on the VB-MAPP, and then I can also demonstrate that on the VOA, then I can say with more certainty that, yes, this individual does have a high Manning repertoire. Now, we're still out on the limb, right? But at least now we have a little bit more evidence to be out on the limb with. So that's what they were attempting to do here. Another point that they wanted to bring up is that the VB-MAPP is a very, very long assessment. It can take a really long time to run. There can be challenges in payment through insurance providers for doing a reassessment for a VB-MAPP, given that there's usually a small amount of hours that they're going to be willing to pay for reassessment, and the VB-MAPP always is more hours than that. So they also wanted to check to see if we did this with a shorter assessment, will we get some similar types of results. So there were 5 participants in this study. All of them were diagnosed with ASD or developmental disability. They were ages 2 to 6. And for each of them, they completed the verbal operant analysis and the VB-MAPP within 1 week of each other. Tried to keep things relatively standard across the two, although the VB-MAPP was longer than the verbal operant analysis. They used an FR1 reinforcement schedule for both, and they ran the VB-MAPP just as described already. And then for the VOA, the verbal operant analysis, they had 5 conditions that they went through 3 times each, because again, they were much shorter. They always did demanding first. So for MAND, it was like a free operant preference assessment. They just let them go around the room and identify anything that they wanted.
I love that.
Through MAND, right?
I wish that was all like cotton candy and M&Ms and Reese's peanut butter cups.
It sounds great. I think it was mostly toys.
You know what? Don't ruin it for me.
Okay.
Wait, why can't you just run the VB-MAPP in the local candy shop?
Candy. I'm all for it. That sounds wonderful.
If you're not getting a high rate of men at the candy shop, that you got to work on that.
Right?
Work on that operating immediately.
Well,
Stop the assessment.
They don't like candy.
What?
That doesn't
What?
happen.
Colleen,
Willy Wonka makes everything he bakes. Okay, so first they did the mand, and then after that they did the 4 other conditions, but they varied the order, the different times that they ran it. So they used the item that they established in the free operant preference assessment moving forward for the other conditions, which I thought was really clever. So for the echoic condition, let's say that the child picked a ball. For the echoic condition, the ball was put away, and then they had them say ball to see if they said ball, but the only reinforcement that was presented was praise, right? So this way, the ball wasn't present, so it couldn't have been...
And they didn't get the ball.
...misconstrued as attacked, and they didn't get the ball, so it shouldn't be misconstrued as a mand.
Makes sense.
Then in the tact condition, they had the item present, and they said, what's this? And the child might say ball. But regardless of whether they said ball, they didn't get the ball. They only got social praise again in order to discriminate that from the mand. And then they had an interverbal condition. So to continue our example, they would fill in the blank with, you roll the, and then maybe the child would say ball. In this case, the item was not present. So that was that. And then they did a control condition. And this one, was sort of to check for multiple control. So it was when the item was present, but out of reach, did they mand/tact for the item? So you can't tell which one is really going on, right? So they compared those to see out of the number of opportunities in each of those VOA sections, did the child emit the verbal operant? And then they compared that to the results of the VB-MAPP using what they call the stimulus control ratio, meaning they took the scores from each and divided by the total opportunities that the child had to respond and then made that into a percentage just in order to allow us to make a comparison. And then they did the graphs in a pretty cool way. So they arranged each graph for each participant with a midpoint line on the x-axis and had the results for the VB-MAPP going horizontally in one direction in like blue, and then the results for the VOA going horizontally in the other direction in orange. So it allowed you to see, and then it was broken down by like mand and then tact and then echoic. So it allowed you to see if this child scored highly on the mand for the VB-MAPP, did they also score highly on the mand for the VOA, basically, is kind of how it broke down. So you would, if you saw high convergent validity for these two assessments, you would expect to see high scores for each assessment for that particular child or low scores for that particular operant for that particular child, which I just kind of liked the way that they arranged that. And guess what? Overall, they did see convergent validity for these two assessments. So the takeaway here is that the verbal operant analysis is a lot more limited in scope than the VB-MAPP, but they were able to capture those basic verbal operant responding with the VOA in the same fashion that one would for the VB-MAPP, but it's not able to look at some of the more complex responding that one might see for the VB-MAPP, as well as the other areas of the VB-MAPP that are typically tested.
Yeah, I think it could really inform your VB-MAPP by using those techniques, because sometimes when we're running the VB-MAPP, me and some of the RBTs will look at each other and we'll go, was that a tact or was that a mand? Or when you're testing all of these things and you're in an environment like public school, it's easy to not be sure sometimes.
Yeah.
So being able to kind of functionally assess it that way a little bit might be helpful in reassuring you that, yes, I should be recording that as a mand, or I should be recording that as a tact. So
yeah, that's a good point, because, in the VB-MAPP, it'll just say, can tact 10 items. Right? And if you're not thinking that with that level of precision about what does it mean to tact something, even if it's present, then one can never be sure if they're just manding for the item or tacting it, then you could easily sort of get into some murky waters with the way they are scoring the VB-MAPP. So it is kind of nice to have the examples that they gave here for the VOA to help delineate that and break it down.
It's very clear how you would run, like if you were trying to run a mand trial or a echoic trial, how you would have to set it up. I think that's what's helpful about it.
Totally.
Yeah.
But you're not going to get the more rich picture of this client's profile or learner profile from the VOA that you can from the VB-MAPP.
I suppose if you were in a situation where like a student had just, moved into town, or you needed to do multiple assessments really quickly just to like get programming in place because you knew you needed some really intense programming, but for some reason you didn't have files or you didn't have other assessments or previous places to drop the ball, you could run the VOA really quickly while you're maybe running an FA for challenging behavior. And in between, you do these little VOA sessions. And so you'd at least have a good starting point until you had, gotten the student a little bit better session behavior. And you felt like a VB-MAPP you'd be able to run more of the VB-MAPP and drill down into some of those subtests. That seemed like it could be another use case. Oh,
makes sense to me.
Yeah. Well, so it is nice to know that there is a test out there, because honestly, until I was looking at this article, I had just sort of assumed like, well, Mark Sonnenberg's been doing this a long time and I know verbal behavior. That's pretty old. So I assume this assessment is everything it's supposed to be. And you know what? It's really easy to make that mistake sometimes. Well, not mistake, but in this case, but to make that assumption sometimes. So it was nice that someone was saying, hey, let's take a look at this more directly.
And that is how I think that our two articles kind of dovetail together, right? Is that there's really not been a lot of research with capital R on the VB-MAPP to say, well, how exactly should it be run? Or how best should we really train it? Or is it testing the things that we're saying that it's testing? Right? So there's so much room out there to explore this further. I think it's a really useful tool for practitioners, but it might be also helpful to have some additional research studies examining it closely.
Yeah. Well, with that, we've gone over the articles, we've gone over the VB-MAPP. What I think might be good is why don't we move a little early into dissemination station, and we'll talk about some like general questions and some general kind of take-home points from our own experiences. Oh, here we are. Whoa, it's the candy station next to the VB-MAPP store. Oh, my goodness. $850 because all that's in there are like delicious candies.
I'm
from
bathing
Paris.
In Whoppers.
I want some Almond Joys. I know everyone hates Almond Joy, but I think it's a good candy.
Whoppers?
I do.
Oh God!
I really like the
Whoppers. Make me like my teeth the sound on your teeth.
Everybody.
Love that. No, I hate that.
That's why you need so many candies, Colleen. Because if I only had Whoppers in my VB-MAPP assessment, I held them out, in front of you, you'd never man for them. I might say, Colleen's got no man repertoire.
Right. You need multiple exemplars of candy.
Right. That's why it's so expensive. You need like fancy candy. I joked. Everyone was raising my eyebrows that whole time. That was a joke.
Jokes and jokes.
So many jokes here. So I guess one question that might be good is for individuals who have not run the VB-MAPP, they're listening to the show, think, that might be for me, is how did you come to find the VB-MAPP as a professional and then decide this is an assessment I want to have in my repertoire?
For me, it was insurance mandated.
So if someone tells you have to do the VB-MAPP, congratulations, you're doing the VB-MAPP.
Right. I didn't use it in previous places of employment. I'd heard about it, but it wasn't part of my course sequence. I didn't learn about it in school. I knew about it just because other people use it in the field. But when we started our center, insurance asked us to do it. And so then I bought the book, bought the protocol, went to a workshop, and learned how to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think I probably would have done that too, but it was out of necessity.
Yeah.
I needed to
sped up your timetable.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted an alternative to the ABLES, to be honest, because the ABLES in public school takes so long. And you think the VB-MAPP takes long, the ABLES takes really long. So I felt like it was a good alternative, and I really felt like it got at a lot of the things we really needed to target with the kids. I mean, the biggest deficit for kids on the spectrum is their language use, so it really breaks that down. So that's kind of why I prefer it to the ABLES.
Yeah. Dana, how about you? Okay.
Same.
Same as mine, probably.
Same.
All right.
And she teaches it now, too.
True. Did need to learn it for that reason.
Okay. So when we talk about implementing it, I think depending on the setting, many of us have been in different settings, private school settings, where you might have a lot of these materials, where there's knowledge of verbal behavior, and you kind of go to your little session room and you can run it. But that's not always the case. Even in, say, your center might not always be the case. So sort of what are the environments that you find yourself running a VB-MAPP? And then how have you had to modify your own skill set or the way you present the operants depending on where you are?
Well, like I said, I find myself having to observe a lot of these things in a kindergarten classroom in a public school, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Mm-hmm. I'm observing in the natural environment. And I had to, the first time I tried to do it was such a train wreck because I just had this book in front of me and I'm second guessing if I'm observing the right thing for the right amount of minutes. So I really apologized to that first student. It was the worst VB-MAPP you would ever probably get in your life. So that's why I made my handy little observation checklists so that I could be more focused in what I was looking at, get an understanding of how they might be functioning, and go from there. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So, we also have a sub-separate setting that the kids have access to. So, depending on where they spend most of their time is where I would try to observe them. Mm-hmm. Is, this is where this kid mostly is. Let's observe them here.
Yeah. You just have such a limited amount of time. And I know the observation form was very, very helpful. Mm-hmm. One of the big things that drives me nuts about the VB-MAPP, and it's sort of a good drives me nuts, is I feel like I'm always trying to kind of min-max it. I want to maximize, I got every operant in the shortest amount of time, because it always feels like one of those assessments that if I just thought about this a little harder, if I just presented the right combination of flashcards and items and toys and candies and whatever, I could fly through this so much faster.
Yeah, see, I try not to overthink it like that anymore after doing it for many years because it's a baseline, right? Mm-hmm. And I look at it as an instructional tool as well. I'm trying to write an IEP for this student and they're going to need to work on some things. So understanding that going into it. I don't think it's a bad thing that the first study that you talked about only did level 1 and 2. Mm-hmm. I mean, for a student who's very young, especially preschool, I haven't really used this with students older than first grade. Maybe a second grader was the oldest, depending on their functioning level. Mm-hmm. That, doing level 1 and 2, I think off the bat is, as an initial assessment, is fine. I think you're going to get a lot of information. And if they can do everything, like I said earlier, you might want to be looking at other ways to assess them too. So I really try to look at it as a baseline inventory for what they can do and where can we go from here.
So kind of on the same tack, Colleen, when we talked about sort of the assessment kit being very, very expensive and getting the materials together and how there's always this sense of trying to be efficient because this assessment could take a long time. You famously had a VB-MAPP cabinet that you put together over like a year or so.
I did. I was like, did you sign that out? I'm going to check it. You have 2 days with that. No, I'm just kidding.
We actually do that though.
No, I am keeping the key. I'm sleeping with it under my pillow.
We do the same thing though with our VB assessment. People have to sign out the materials.
So that was so a kit is great. So that was even though we had a kit, but you still have to organize the kit, right? Because it's very difficult if you're just rifling. Hold on, child.
Right.
Let me find this stuff in the kit.
These photos that are in level 1.
So you do, if you have access to the student over a course of days, it's nice to kind of break the assessment up and say, all right, for this chunk of time, we're running this part or these parts that we can run together. And over time, I think the more you run it, the more you know kind of what things you can target together easily. Gather those materials, run that portion, refile them and sign them back in and get your other ones. But after I left the preschool, I had to sadly leave my VB-MAPP cabinet.
Oh, no.
Because I could not take the materials because I did not have $829 lying around to purchase them on my own. So I put together at my current job just a regular old whatever I could find kit, which is fine. If that's what you have access to, you can still run the VB-MAPP as long as you're using some clinical judgment as to what materials you need. And if you understand how many exemplars of things you need to gather, you can still put together a pretty good VB-MAPP kit given access to, used toys and Google images.
That's how we did it. Yep. We made our own VB. We did not have starting a center, had money just lying around for anything really.
Yeah.
And so I, over 6 to 8 months, along with the clinical director at the center, just kept looking for things. We're like, that can go on our VB-MAPP kit.
You become really weirdly in tune to I can use this for manned 6M.
Right. Yep.
Let's put it in the kit. Let's put it in the VB-MAPP bucket.
We had one of the rolling carts.
Yes. I don't even have that. I just have a big bucket. Like envelopes right now. And,
Yeah.
If you're starting out and you haven't run a VB-MAPP before, there are a lot of really good resources because, teachers and BCBAs are really good at sharing. So people do share things online. I've found a lot of great resources online that I've just kind of held on to. Not just on the VB-MAPP, website itself gives you kind of good appendices and checklists you can use. But, some people in grad school have made little projects out of, making a data collection system for the VB-MAPP. So I have things I like to use, but again, I think it's getting comfortable with what do you like to use? What makes it make sense to you to collect data efficiently? And that's what you should put together for yourself so that when you have to pull this out next time, here's my go-to things that make this easy for me to run.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We should point out, you do have to buy the assessment itself.
Yes,
you
do. That's not that expensive.
Right, that part's non-negotiable.
Yeah. Those are not free online.
Yeah, and none of the things you would find online would make sense unless you had the protocol and the assessment booklet. However, people have made, good data sheets to streamline how many things you need to collect for this specific one. So you can, pull that out and know, oh, we've gotten to half a point because they've done this many.
Yeah, especially,
that sort of thing.
Yeah, level 2 and level 3, if you don't have something that you thought about ahead of time in terms of how you're organizing it, it gets very hard to keep track of just the sheer volume of different operands that you need to assess. And did I ask that one already? Did I ask it in this format with this combination, or was it that one? Because, again, topographically, a lot of the materials that you're going to ask are going to look exactly the same. It's just, how did I ask this? How did I present this? My bear flashcard could be used for so many of the subtests.
Trying to write it in the margins on the booklet is not a great system.
Yeah.
It's not.
So what would you say are the areas, so for someone starting out with the VB-MAPP, that they should pay the most attention to? And then as someone who's run the VB-MAPP a number of times, but sort of wants to up their game, where would you say that they could focus on?
Well, again, I think if you're first starting out, you do have to pay attention to, am I asking this? Am I framing this trial so that it is actually testing the operand? That can be a little confusing, especially when you read through the first time you're doing it. Definitely reading the manual first very closely is helpful. I found kind of taking it in chunks. I'm going to focus on level 1 with this student. So I'm going to get familiar with all the level 1 portions and then, moving on from there. If you're doing this for the first time, I think that over time, focusing on, level 3 is, I think, the hardest level to run. There's so many things to gather information about, just numbers wise, to get a score. But also observing things in level 3 can, I think, be the most difficult. I think the observation can be, of all the levels, can be deceptive for how easy it is. I think you have to be paying attention to the time criteria. Am I actually observing what I'm supposed to observe? It's hard too, because you might be like, I'm the only BCBA in my school right now. I don't have someone to grab and say, unless I make an appointment with Rob to come over and can you do some IOA and make sure I'm, so you just have to kind of judge yourself a little bit, keep yourself honest for, did I really observe what I thought I observed? And, using video is helpful sometimes too. Set up a video, use your iPad for that half hour and go back and count afterwards or something like that.
That's a good idea. Yeah, again, especially those higher levels where you're just trying to keep everything organized, you're trying to keep the sessions fun. I find most kids enjoy the VB-MAPP because you're changing up what you're doing, you're taking lots of breaks, and they don't know, I'm actually doing my assessment right now while we play.
Right. And, for kids who have been in a program, some of the things you're doing aren't that different in format from what they're used to. So that's a nice thing about it. They don't really even know they're being assessed sometimes, So I think in that way, it can be a very valid measure of what a student can do because, they're tacting things all the time. You're teaching them to match to sample and just doing it with some new things now. So it's not taking them out of their comfort zone and, that. But I feel like we're talking about all the bad things about the VB-MAPP. It's really not that aversive.
No, it's not. It's fun. I think it's a very fun assessment. And when I've ever been frustrated with it, I think it's usually more I'm frustrated with myself. Like, oh, I know I could do this better if I just remembered to XYZ, or, oh, if I wrote it out like this next time, I could get my materials a little bit faster. I've always had fun running it. The students I think I've run it with have always seemed to be having a pretty good time. And again, I think it very directly tells me exactly what I want to know to provide meaningful instruction.
Right.
How have you found, and again, this, I think for everybody, how have you found either other professionals when you've been going over the results of the VB-MAPP? Have you found them to understand what you're talking about easily? Has it been a harder sell? And then how have parents or clients have found, getting the results of the VB-MAPP or the use of the VB-MAPP in planning?
I think that you have to be careful not to over BCBA speak when you're explaining it, because, especially people just think, why are you making up that word manding when it just means asking for something,
right? Yes.
So I just try to explain it like that. Whenever I write up a report, I make sure to interpret the terminology. And I think the more people have gotten used, I think people are skeptical at first, but then when they see how useful the information can be, especially when you run it a second time, or, how I've sat behind Sundberg at Babbitt and been like, Rob, should I show him my huge binder of VB-MAPP programs that I've written? So if you're listening, we could go further into this business together. I'm just kidding. But no, over time, because I do use it so much, I've just written programs for it. Google Drive now is a wonderful place to store things that are searchable. So you can literally type in, I need a program for TACT 15M, and up it pops. So I think the more you kind of commit to structuring your instruction around the assessment and how it can inform your instruction, the easier it will become. The more payoff it will be. It will directly help you for this student immediately. So I think once people see that and then can kind of understand what you're programming for based on the assessment, they see its utility. And then, I think it's better. And I think parents respond. I think the graph that you can show them is really nice. I think parents, like so often with norm referenced assessments, parents get quote unquote bad news,
Yes.
So when you show them this, look at what they've learned in 6 months, and they can actually point to a thing that their student or their child is doing like in their life. Then they go, oh, okay, yeah, I get it. That's cool. I see why we're targeting these things. I see why we're running this assessment.
So would you consider fully understanding how to run and implement the VB-MAPP to be a behavioral cusp, in that it now allows you, the experimenter, to access new reinforcers in your environment?
Yes.
You heard it here first, folks.
That sounds like a think piece article. VB-MAPP, it's behavioral cusp. And then you got colon. How I learned to stop worrying and love the VB-MAPP.
Yeah, right. Stop worrying and get stuff done.
Oh, don't you see it? Even on my VB-MAPP binder, it says, keep calm and use the VB-MAPP.
Oh.
I love you, VB-MAPP.
Colleen, I was singing beautiful. Your praises. Diana and I were doing some planning earlier today, and I said, if Colleen were here, I'd just have some like random idea, and then you'd put it in a binder in about 10 minutes.
With a fancy cover.
Oh, it's such a good skill. So again, much like Lucy and Ethel, you're answering questions, you're kind of stacking the deck in terms of your forte is really like, I like that idea. I'm going to make it a little bit better and organized.
But don't feel like you can't do the VB-MAPP if making binders is not your thing.
No, I ran the VB-MAPP, and that is something I'm terrible at, staying organized.
Trying to read your own chicken scratch notes.
Oh, reading my own. Oh, man. Like, I made this data sheet. Ooh, what were the FFCs I used? And I still got it done. Got great results. All right. Well, I think we are all wrapped up with our talk about the VB-MAPP. What a lot of fun it was to talk about the VB-MAPP. I hope you all agree.
I had a great time.
I had a great time too.
I'm glad Colleen was here.
Yes. Thank you, Colleen, so much for coming.
It only took Rob, what is this? I've known Rob for how long? And I only took you 121 episodes to invite me on the
You were
show.
On many of our Babbitt special episodes. If people want to go back and hear Colleen, you can hear eating chicken wings.
You can hear me complaining about lunch when they moved to the DCU.
Yeah, you've had plenty of great.
My biggest reinforcer is food, so. But not Whopper candies.
Not Whopper candies, but other foods.
The only thing.
Chicken wings, yes.
Chicken wings, yes. That's a big yes. So thank you guys all for being here. And thanks all of you so much for listening. If you liked ABA Inside Track, why not find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Stitcher, or wherever you want to get podcasts. There are a lot of ways that you can reach out to us. Certainly, you can find us on all the social media sites as ABA Inside Track. You can find these episodes posted on YouTube with YouTube subtitling feature. And of course, you can find them on our website, abainsidetrack.com, where we have links to all of the articles that we discussed today on this episode. Oh, before we go, I almost forgot to give you that second secret code word. If you're interested in learning credits, it is fruit. F-R-U-I-T. Fruit. Like apples, oranges, pineapples, kiwis. Please don't just name your favorite fruit, though. Just write the word fruit. You can think it while you write it, though. That's fine. But we just need to see the word fruit. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of the episode. Big thanks again to Colleen for joining us on the show. Big thanks to Diana and Jackie as well for being here, as always. We also want to send out a special thank you to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our opening and closing song, for Kyle Sturry for our interstitial, to Daniel Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his editing work, and to Hollis Urban of the Sycamore Workshop for his graphic design. Well, that brings us to the end of the episode. We'll see you all next week for another full-length research discussion, but until then, keep responding. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.